my dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got another book talk video to share with you guys. And today we're talking about The Lying Game by Ruth Ware. Now this is the third book by Ruth Ware that I've read, and in fact it's the third book by her that I'm filming a book talk video for. I've had varying degrees of success with her stories. The first one that I read was In a Dark, Dark Wood, and I'll admit I was immediately intrigued by the title and the cover. Both just really appealed to me, so I grabbed it, and I really didn't like it. I didn't like it one bit. It's not that the writing's bad, the writing's not bad in any of her books that I've read. It's just that with In a Dark, Dark Wood, I found it so painfully predictable that I was calling the end twist halfway through the book. And then when I got to the end and saw I was right, I was really disappointed. Fast forward a few years later and I picked up The Death of Mrs. Westaway. Again, a really catchy title in my opinion. But this time I really liked the book. I figured, you know, a few years had passed. She put out a few books in between those two, and it really felt to me that she had matured as a storyteller. And I really liked it. I thought it was a great story. So now here we are with The Lying Game. This actually came out before The Death of Mrs. Westaway, and so I was a little kind of iffy about it. I picked up a bunch of used books, and this was one of them. So I hadn't even really sought it out, but when I saw it, I thought, let's give it a go. And I'm actually, in the next little while, I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but I'm going to have a fourth book review from her with her most recent book that just came out. So we'll have that to look forward to as well if you like the Ruth Ware book talks and Ruth Ware in general. So let's get into The Lying Game before I tell you my final thoughts on it and where on the dark, dark wood to Mrs. Westaway spectrum it lies. So this book is about a woman named Isa Wilde, and she is a adult and she's in her early 30s, and one night she wakes up because she hears her phone go off and there's a text message there, and the message simply reads, "I need you." And despite the fact that it's very late at night / early in the morning, however you want to look at it, she gets up and immediately starts packing to go. She's got a 6-month-old daughter. She's getting the kid ready to go. She's telling her husband that she has to go catch up with an old friend. There's an emergency and she needs to go. So he's kind of like, okay, weird, but he doesn't, you know, he doesn't protest too much, and off she goes. We begin to get some flashbacks about when Isa was a teenager and she was sent to a boarding school. Her home life wasn't great because her mother was very ill with cancer, her father was constantly in and out of the hospital, and just really didn't have the time to dedicate to Isa and her brother Will. So eventually he sets them both up in separate boarding homes and or boarding schools, and they're sent away. The school where Isa goes is in a small town in England called Salton, and when she's there she meets some new friends. Two she meets immediately at the train station on the way to the school. Their names are Kate, who is the woman who sent the text message through the night, and another girl named Thea. And immediately we get the sense that these girls, they're not nice girls, they're mean girls, and they have this game that they play called The Lying Game, where it's what it sounds like. They'll tell lies to teachers, classmates, whatever. If they can take the lie far enough that they can convincingly get whoever the target is to truly believe it, then they get 10 points. And Isa kind of gets swept into their group right away because, you know, she doesn't know anyone, and they become thick as thieves, the three of them, as well as a fourth girl who's also new, and her name is Fatima. They also meet her, I believe, at the train station, and then Isa and Fatima are roommates once they get to Salton School. So for the first little bit, we're getting flashbacks learning about Isa's time at school while she's also traveling back to Salton, where Kate still lives, to find out what's going on. Through the flashbacks, we learn that Kate lived in Sultan, as she still does, but she was still at the boarding school, and she would go home and she'd take her friends and they'd go to her home. Her dad was a teacher at the school. He was an art teacher and a really talented artist on his own. But then soon we learn that during the summer of the first year that Isa and Fatima were at the school, there was something happened, and Ambrose is Kate's father, he ends up dead from an apparent suicide. So as Isa is traveling, she kind of knows why she's being called back, but at this point we don't know. We don't know what the secret is, what it is that's bringing her back to town. So there's a bunch of pages dedicated to the travel, and then when she finally gets to Kate's, she, you know, it's a reunion. It's a big reunion because they hadn't seen each other in many years. It had been 17 years since they were in high school, and then they had seen each other once more when Isa's mom died, and then they hadn't seen each other since. And so you get the feeling that there's also, as well as whatever's going on, there's a lot of catching up to do. So once all of the girls are finally at the house where Kate grew up and where she lived with her father when she was a teenager, Kate finally spills the news that a human bone had been found on the beach, because the house where Kate lives, it's right on the water, and you know, it's a seaside English town, and so a human bone had been found in the water, like on the beach, and that's what's made Kate freak out and call everyone back. And so there's more like talking between them, between all of them, while we still don't know quite what's going on. But then eventually we do find out what's going on. And what it is that, so back during the school days, it was one afternoon on a Friday when Kate went back to her home and found that her dad had passed away. So panicking, she calls her friends and gets them to help her bury him in the sand. And they think that he's deep enough and far out enough that he will never be found, because the tide goes in and out, and they've really just worked to get him in the ground. And the reason they're doing it is because, you know, at this time they're 15 years old and they're scared and they don't know what to do. So all throughout this, there's a fifth person involved, and that's a boy named Luke. And he was Kate's technically stepbrother, although they didn't really have a sibling relationship, because what happened was Ambrose met Luke's mom when he was very young, and him and the mom, they divorced while the children were still very young. And then Luke went away, and Kate didn't see him for many years until Luke was a teenager, at which point his mom called Ambrose and said, you know, I need a break. He's out of hand. I can't do this on my own. Can he come spend the summers with you? And Ambrose says, you know, sure. Because the thing about Ambrose is we get the feeling he's very eccentric and all that. And, you know, there's parts where you're a little wondering if he's a little sketchy, but what it comes down to is that he's a dedicated father who would do anything for his children, including Luke, his stepson. So he of course says yes, and Luke starts coming in the summers, and so that's when the girls all meet him, and so he's kind of spending time with them as well. So meanwhile, in the present day, after they all get this news and they're kind of all freaking out, they don't know what to do, Isa takes her 6-month-old daughter, Freya, and they bundle up and she decides to take Freya into the city. She needs to go to the bank machine, things like that. And so she bundles her up, they walk into town, and when she's in town, she runs into Luke, which is a complete shock. Kate hadn't mentioned that he was in town. Because the last she had heard, he had went back to France, because after Ambrose had died, he got sent away because he couldn't, of course, stay there any longer. And so when Isa sees him in the store, she's shocked, but he greets her with a really angry, he's very angry, and she's taken aback by it. She doesn't know what's gotten into him and why he's so upset. So eventually she gets out of there, she goes back to the house, and she confronts Kate, and she's kind of like, what is going on here? Luke's in town, why didn't you know? And Kate plays it off as though she didn't know, that's why she didn't tell them. So in order to have a reason as to why they're all in town, Kate had bought them all tickets to like a alumni dinner for the school. So that way it doesn't appear too suspicious that a human remain was found on the beach, and now all of a sudden these girls are back in town. And the thing with these girls is they had a reputation around town for being bad news because of the lies they would tell that game they had. So now all of their peers are now the adults in the town, and they're really put off by them because nobody had a good experience with these girls. And as the story progresses too, you learn that, you know, they made some really nasty, life-ruining lies. So it's not nice girls. So eventually they go to the dinner. It's weird, it's awkward. Everyone's weird and awkward with them, and vice versa. And then the next day, Isa's just like, you know what, I'm going home. I want to go home. I want to take my baby and I want to go home. So they all disperse and go home. Isa goes home to her husband, and you know, she's very happy to see him, but she's off because there's so much going on in her head with the body being found, because by the time she leaves, the whole body's been found pretty much, and they've identified it as Ambrose. So Owen, her husband, he's quickly aware that something's wrong, but she won't tell him what it is, even though she's acting really sketchy around him. And then the next morning, a bouquet of roses show up at their door, and she was in bed, so Owen, her husband, opened it because there was no name on the card. And the card basically says, like, I'm so sorry for losing my temper. I never should have done that, Luke. And so he's like, Luke, I thought you went to spend time with your school friends. And she's like, well, I did. And he's like, then who's Luke? So she explains that it's Kate's stepbrother and whatnot, but she just keeps acting weirder and weirder, to the point that Owen starts to think that she went down there to have an affair with Luke. So it becomes a whole mess. So listen, if you don't want spoilers, now's the time to click away. What I'll say is The Lying Game is a page turner. All of Ruth Ware's stories, they're page turners. At least in my experience, the three I've read, they've all been page turners. Even in A Dark Wood, the one that I didn't particularly care for, still a page turner. This one is the same. And it didn't have the complete predictability that In A Dark Wood did, so I appreciated that. I still really liked The Death of Mrs. Westaway better, but this one was pretty good. It was better than I thought it was going to be, honestly. So if you like a fast-paced thriller, after hearing what I've said about the first part of the book, if you're intrigued, I would definitely recommend picking it up, giving it a read, seeing what you think of it. And if you want the spoilers, we're going to get into some of them. We're going to kind of go a little quickly because this video feels like it's already really long. So I'm not going to get into everything, but I'll give you the major points. So after a few days pass, Kate, I believe, texts again and says, you know, you need to come back, because she's being brought in for questioning because they're starting to put the pieces together and start to look at the members of, you know, the liars group and wondering about it. And of course this makes Isa very panicked because she doesn't want to lose her daughter. She doesn't want to go to prison, especially since, you know, they were 15 years old. They were helping their friend. They didn't kill anybody. And as time goes on and she starts to think more and more and more about things, she thinks about the suicide letter that was found with Ambrose when Kate found him. And she begins to read it, not as a child. You know, the last time she read it, she was 15 years old. She begins to read it now as an adult, really listening to the words that he wrote. And it all suddenly comes together when she's back in town. She goes into, she takes a cab into the village, and she's going to a store, and there, the mother of one of her classmates tells her, you know, I never liked Kate, and we knew this all along because this woman, Mary, she acted very rude to Kate every time they ran into each other. And she says, you know, it always seems suspicious to me after her father told her that she was being sent to a new school, you know, then all of a sudden he ends up dead. And this was news to Isa. She's like, Kate's dad was sending her to a new school? And she's like, yep. And I'm guessing she didn't like that very much, and then she ends up dead. So she takes that info and the letter, and she starts to piece it all together. And then the final sort of nail in the coffin for her theory of what happened is when Ambrose was found, he had been found with heroin in his system because the wine bottle that he had heroin in it. And Fatima, she's a doctor, the friend Fatima, and she says, you know, if you were trying to hurt yourself, drinking heroin isn't the way you do it. You'd inject it, because if you did that, you'd be dead in minutes. But if you were to orally ingest it, that could take a long time, and you'd need a lot of the drug. And so she's like, that doesn't make any sense. And then once that piece of the puzzle is put together, it all comes together for Isa, and she thinks, okay, Kate poisoned him. And somehow he knew. And so in his letter, the letter that he wrote, he was absolving her of what happened. It was his final act of protecting his daughter. Like he knew once it was in his system, it was too late. He knew he'd been poisoned, but he still didn't want her to pay the price for it. And they're like, oh my goodness. So she's like, okay, we need to all get together back here again and confront Kate. And so they do. And oddly enough, she confesses to all of it. And that doesn't make, you know, they're all kind of put off about it. There's no anger, there's no defensiveness. She's just like, yep, that's what I did. You got it. I'm gonna go to the cops tomorrow and I'll leave you guys out of it. You don't have to worry. It's all over. It's all done. And they're all kind of like, okay. Meanwhile, Isa has after all of the denying she did to her husband about having a relationship or a fling with Luke, she ends up kissing him, and because when she was 15 years old, she had had a big crush on him, but he hadn't been interested in her at all. So they're kind of fooling around. I don't know why, but they're kind of fooling around, and then they look and they see Kate standing on the stairs, and she runs back up the stairs, and they're both kind of like, oh my gosh. So that night they go to bed, and Luke tries to tell her to leave, that she's not safe in the house, that he doesn't think it's good for her to be there. But she's like, listen, it's the middle of the night. I'm not taking my 6-month-old daughter out to God knows where in the middle of the night. And he's like, well, you can come to my place. And she's like, I'm not doing that. And so she goes to bed, and she wakes up the next morning, and they're all, or early in the morning, like in the middle of the night kind of, and she can hear Kate yelling, and she can hear Luke yelling, and you know, she wakes up the other girls, and they go up and they can hear it, and they can hear them, and suddenly it all comes together. It wasn't Kate who had poisoned Ambrose, it was Luke. And it wasn't Kate who was being sent away, it was Luke, because Ambrose had found out that Kate and Luke were a couple. And when he found out, he kind of flew off the handle, even though Kate's trying to explain to him, like, I know it sounds weird, but, you know, he's my stepbrother, but not really. We didn't grow up together. You know, I knew him briefly when I was little, and then I met him again as a teenager, and I'm in love with him. But Ambrose he's not having any of it, and he's getting ready to send Luke away. And that just kind of tips Luke right over the edge. And it was him who poisoned Ambrose. And then in a final kind of moment during their fight, somehow the house catches on fire. I'm thinking Luke caught it on fire. And then everyone's trying to get out of the house. And then Isa turns around and she said, no, Freya's up in the bedroom. That's her 6-month-old daughter. And Luke's like, you can't come up here. There's too much smoke. You go outside, stand under the window, and I will toss her down to you, which he does. And then, you know, everyone but Luke is outside, and they're yelling at him, come on, jump, jump. And at first he's going to, but then all of a sudden this like peace comes over him and he says he's not going to. And he just kind of retreats back into the smoke. And then Kate, freaking out, she runs in after him, though they're yelling at her not to go. And then both of them perish in the fire, and it's kind of a fitting ending, I guess, to their story. I'm realizing now that as I was telling you that last bit, those were two separate nights that I kind of mashed into one night. But anyway, if you're at this point because you're not wanting to read the book, you get the gist of the story anyway. But yeah, those were two separate nights. So there you go, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, I'd recommend it if you like a good, fast-paced, sort of thrilling story. This definitely delivers that. Is it a hefty literary masterpiece? No, but you know, sometimes it's just fun to have some fun with a story, and this is definitely that. In the coming weeks, I've got some real exciting book talks coming up, you guys. We've got the Testaments coming up. We've got Stephen King's new book coming up. I've got a book talk dedicated to a friend of mine that I've known for about 15 years now, who's a fantastic author, and I can't wait to share him with you guys. Then we've got some spooky books coming up in October. We've got all kinds of fun things. So if you haven't already, please subscribe. If you like these book talks, you don't want to miss anything, I'm telling you. And I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.